great to see such a nice turnout on a rainy Thursday evening, so we're glad everyone's here. My name's Carol Beck. I'm the Assistant Director of the Emory-Tibet Partnership, and I just want to make a couple of brief announcements, and then we'll jump right in. What we are talking about this evening is cognitively based compassion training and its research, accompanying research. If you are interested in actually learning from an experiential side, we have two upcoming courses, one at Emory. One is a 10-week course. It's being taught by Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi. And that one begins Monday night. So if you are interested in doing that, there are some flyers out in the gallery area on the counter. Send me an email tomorrow and I'll get in touch with you. We also have a 2-weekend intensive version that will be on September 20th and 21st and October 18th and 19th. And that is hosted here at Drepung Losling, so in this meditation hall. The other course is on the Emory campus in some place where there is free parking. So we try to make it as convenient as possible. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Brendan Azawa da Silva. He's an associate professor at Life University. He's also been intimately involved with cognitively based compassion training for quite some time, both on the theory side and on the practical research side. And I'm going to turn the show over to him, and he's going to introduce our two esteemed panelists tonight, Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi and Dr. Charles Rezan.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol, and thanks to all of you for coming out for this event. It's great to see a full house here, so thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce our two distinguished panelists this evening, and to be here with really the two founders of cognitively based compassion training, the two people who came up with this crazy idea just about 10 years ago now. We have with us here Dr. Charles Rezan, visiting from the University of Arizona, where he is professor of psychiatry. And Dr. Rezan, before he was at Arizona, where he is engaged in the scientific study of cognitively based compassion training and has been instrumental in founding a center there called the Center for Compassion and Secular Ethics, which is wonderful. Before that, he was here at Emory, which is where he met and befriended Geshe Lobsang and started the scientific research on compassion meditation here. So it's wonderful to have him back here with us again, and thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
We also have with us Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi, who is the director of the Emory-Tibet Partnership at Emory University, plays a key role at Emory in all the activities related to the Emory's relationship to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and His Holiness's visits here, and the Emory-Tibet Science Initiative, and the cognitively based compassion training program. Geshe Lobsang is also a senior lecturer at Emory University, where he also did his PhD, and he's also the founder and spiritual director of Drepung Losling, our center here. So thank you, Geshe-la, for being here with us. I'd like to start with a question first to Geshe-la, and then a question for Dr. Rezan. And the format will be, I'll ask these two gentlemen a few questions first, get the conversation going, and then after about 20, 30 minutes, we'll open it up to general discussion, so please think of your own questions. And I've been told that our live streaming audience also has the ability to type in and ask questions, so hopefully we'll get that participation too. So that's great, yeah. So Geshe Lobsang, around 2004, 2005, you developed this protocol, cognitively based compassion training, which is now nearing its 10th year and has spawned a lot of research projects and a lot of outreach projects for many, many different populations, which is wonderful. Around that time, meditation research was already starting to become much more popular, but mainly around the study of mindfulness-based practices like mindfulness-based stress reduction. So what was it that prompted you to want to develop a different protocol, and what was your thinking rather than kind of joining the ongoing research on mindfulness.
First of all, good evening, and welcome to this discussion here. And thank you, Brendan, for the introductions and the question. It's wonderful to be with the old friend here.
Yeah, we've been at it a long
at
time.
this discussion tonight. With regard to cognitively based compassion training, why and how we came to develop this protocol and study this. It's obviously, as Brendan, as you mentioned, that the meditation research was already kind of growing back in 2002, 3, maybe even before. And they were primarily in two areas. I think there was an earlier version of meditation research that really had a lot of kind of the studies done, was involving TM meditation, transcendental meditation, and then the second one, mindfulness-based stress reduction program developed by John Kabat-Zinn. And since the request really, although Chuck and I have been discussing for quite a number of years to do a research on some form of meditation and its related health benefits, but the specific impetus for this program was a request from one of the students at Emory University, Molly Harrington, who happened to take a class that I was teaching at Emory, and she felt that in order to address the growing mental health crisis at the time on the campus, something from the Buddhist tradition, perhaps some forms of kind of the mental training that she studied in the course would be very helpful. And so thinking about a specific meditation that actually can be defined, made a protocol, and also it has to be secular, because if it is a Buddhist meditation, it will become a very kind of the limited. But to do something that can be secularized or universalized, and since mindfulness-based meditation research was already growing, there was no need to create another one. Even though Alan Wallace was, I think, that in the process of developing what's called the Shamatha project, the specific meditation with the Shamatha. There were a number of reasons. I wouldn't go into all the details, but my colleague, Dr. John Dunn, will recall actually that how His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with the meditation researchers, had been pushing that they should do something beyond mindfulness. That maybe mindfulness is it's a very broad area, beyond very specific kind of the concentration-based meditation to, more to do something with the analytical format. Perhaps I took that to mean something that you can see in Lamrim, Lojong traditions of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist traditions. So that was the reason that that we needed something that is not studied, but also something that can be kind of manualized. Created a protocol that can be universalized or the secularized, and had the great colleague, at Emory who was dying to do study scientifically, and we had been discussing, and also just the nature of the crisis that Emory was facing, like the depression and all that stress related, and in consultation with Dr. Rezan, that seemed to be the kind of right appropriate or the appropriate meditation to test if that actually has any benefits.
Could you say, I'm going to ask a very similar question to you, Chuck, but could you elaborate a little bit more on what some of the distinctions that you just mentioned, the analytical style of meditation, the Lamrim Lojong basis, why you felt that would be appropriate for a meditation protocol dealing with depression and suicide as opposed to the protocols that were already out there?
It's not so much that whether it would be better or worse. I mean, that's not really was the reason for looking for another protocol. Because as I said, that mindfulness was already, growing, already underway. Actually, that years after that, I remember that we were. I think it was in one of the conferences that we had at Emory. I don't know who was that. Somebody presenting about the meditation research came with this visual thing, like that where they presented like on the highways, like the two super highways, big, with a lot of vehicles, and then a couple of kind of very narrow, tiny streets, just few cars on. And the two big ones was like the TM meditation and the MBSR, mindfulness based. And then the compassion, those were like the little tiny ones. That was
That's right,
like
yeah.
that a few years ago.
Yeah.
So the MBSR was already, that growing. There was no need to really replicate. But what my thinking was that, here, not that I'm a great expert or anything, but had the opportunity to study and to some extent, I guess I could say, immerse into the practice of Lojong, because for many years that as I'd kind of studied and the Buddhist tradition. I felt that there is such a rich knowledge that in the Lojong tradition, and it's developed over several, at least many centuries, over 1,000 years, certainly. And the thing is that the very systematic kind of steps, if you will, the ingredients, if you want to see is something emerging as endearing feeling towards others, compassion, towards others, that feeling or that experience may actually be very helpful for antidote for like loneliness, a sense of alienation, sense of feeling kind of that disconnected and so forth. So, some of the factors are to feel like you are living in the environment, in the world, or around the people that where you are kind of, in constant threat, if you will, where if you think that the depression has to some extent, this kind of element of helplessness, that you can't really, do anything to the challenges and like that. This Lojong tradition has such a rich knowledge about it, and it's something to practice for many centuries, and it's a living tradition, like this. To this day, there are many people who actually have dedicated whole life to go into the mountains, into the caves, and the practice in the Tibetan tradition, right? I mean, so I thought that there is something that can be kind of taken from that tradition, can be learned from that, and see if that actually works. So distinctive features of it. I mean, what distinguishes from standard mindfulness meditation, I think that this analytical process or the cognitive process, that is, as opposed to in the kind of popularly known mindfulness meditations, where that to a certain extent, where you bring your awareness to the present moment, to your feelings, your thoughts, emotions, and so forth and so on, in such a way that you are not kind of reacting to them, not becoming involved, but rather, being aware, so that you can regulate, find a way to regulate by non-judging and so forth. And in the course, that a certain kind of insight and wisdom and understanding may unfold, which would be greatly helpful. To some extent, that process is not directly kind of shaping or reshaping, your perspective about yourself, about others, events that are unfolding in your life. The cognitive or the analytical process involves this active process of not just thinking. I mean, we often, when you think analytical, it often comes across like this is more like just, discursive, more superficial and like that. Not that way. It's more like, finding ways to attune to the actuality of the events, of the situations. It's of course bringing deep into convictional levels, so that you can deeply, ingrain your own those insights that unfold, that insights that you gain to deeply instill, in your experience. So that becomes your lens of kind of relating to the people, the events, things, yourself and others, in ways that can promote, that can present, events in ways that instead of just this is just a kind of unsurmountable threat or problem, nasty and like that, but shifting the perspective. This is like the suffering, like old age, dying. If you take just a couple of examples, to see the universality of these realities. These are part of our ordinary human experience, human nature, but also, that in terms of our perspective about other people, whether they are our friends or the strangers, or even people who are difficult, that instead of just taking them yes, some people are just nasty, like that, and like that, but rather really going beyond those superficial categories that we put people in to relate to, to try to see more of our common humanity, that what are the basic, the fundamental, aspects that actually combine us, that we are similar, like wanting to be happy and to be free from suffering and so forth. So this kind of form of meditation or training, if you will, is it's about actively challenging and reshaping your perspectives about the situations, events in life. So it's in some ways you would think that it's like the cognitive behavioral therapy, that way, as they say, that you change your perception, you will change your feelings. With the changed feelings, you will change your behavior, the response, right? So it because of this active reshaping of your perspectives, it's called cognitive.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to ask you a somewhat similar question to you, but from the research standpoint. When you first met Geshe Lobsang, I know you were interested in studying other forms of meditation, and for a while you were interested in studying the inner heat or tumo meditation. Then about 10 years ago now, you both started this research program on cognitively based compassion training, and now for almost 10 years you've been focusing on research on that and have become a leader in the research on compassion training. And also in an interesting way, in that a lot of the studies that get a lot of attention nowadays are neuroscience studies, brain imaging science studies, but your focus is on the body, on the immune system, and so on and so forth. What, from your perspective as a researcher and a scientist, do you find so interesting about cognitively based compassion training that you've decided to focus on this and do research on this topic?
Right. So it's interesting, you know, and we were talking about this earlier today. It's true. I have a ongoing passionate interest in wishing we could study Tummo. Geshe Lobsang and I were famously rebuffed at a Brazilian steakhouse by one of the great sort of overseers of the Tummo masters who compared me to a goat who was going to go blind out of curiosity. I decided that it wasn't a tractable thing to do at that time for a bunch of reasons. But the interesting thing about Tummo from just a non-practitioner scientific level is this idea that bodily energies can be activated, employed, rechanneled to sort of jumpstart, supercharge the pursuit of higher levels of consciousness, and doing that by creating emotional states that are very stable and positive. And of course, I'm a psychiatrist, so I was very interested in these guys that in their world were doing, using a different physiology, but basically tapping into subtle physical properties to try to establish certain types of mental states. I got so interested in that's how I actually started studying mind-body stuff, and that's how I came to Emory. I actually came to Emory to work with Geshe Lobsang. It wasn't that I showed up here and then made his acquaintance. I chased him down and came here because they had expertise in mind-body stuff. A guy named Andy Miller, who's not known in the meditation world, but he's a great leader of the brain immune system stuff. And I got interested in the immune system because I was curious about why these Tummo guys these practitioners would be trying to tweak their body system, their body temperature. And so I got very interested in the immune system, and when we were having trouble studying Tummo, one of the most important sort of days of my life, I was down at Grady, and Andy Miller is kind of a smart, he's a sassy guy, didn't think much of this meditation stuff, thought I was sort of a California flake, and I was telling him I was just having no luck, you know, and I'd come out here, forget this, look, you want to do this meditation, fine, but why don't you do something in the meantime instead of just wasting your time? If you think it's got something to do with the immune system, why don't you start studying the immune system? You know, we've got this new model. He started looking at people that were getting something called interferon alpha, which is a medicine which turns on inflammation and makes people depressed. He said, you want to study body temperature, get a rectal probe, you can study body temperature in these people getting interferon, figure out what it does, maybe you'll have do this for a while, maybe, you know, the meditation scene will change. And the fateful decision I made was to do that and not to just be intent upon studying meditation. That's a great mistake that many people in the field make. They're so wedded to it that they sometimes don't see that the best road is not necessarily the straightest or the fastest, right? So I embarked on this whole scientific journey of beginning to understand and study with Andy how the brain and the immune system talk to each other, and developed, you know, kind of a reputation there and a fair amount of expertise, but kind of riding Andy's coattails. So that then, about 3-4 years later, when the opportunity to really do a meditation study became all of a sudden tractable, right? When this situation occurred in Geshe Lobsang, and I said, well, you know, what should we do? The reason I was particularly interested in compassion meditation actually had to do with the immune system. So the quick story is there's a lot of evidence that in the modern world we have too much activation of the immune system and something called inflammation. It's a bunch of chemicals it's what happens to you when you get the flu, right? So, you know, you think about the first day that you have the flu and how you feel. That's what inflammation is. That inflammation makes people not want to hang out with other people. You feel tired, you feel sick, you feel down, your body temperature changes, your sleep changes. Well, it turns out that stress activates all those same inflammatory molecules that sickness does. And so we had just discovered a little bit before that, not me, Andy and some of these other guys, that if you put people in a stressful situation, it turned on all the same nasty inflammation that getting sick does. And this is probably one of the main reasons why stress kills people over time. Mm-hmm. There was a concomitant finding, on the other hand, that people that had a lot of social support, people that were positively connected socially with others, so they felt socially integrated, they had people that cared about them, they saw the world as not a battlefield of competition and threat, but as an arena of collaboration and potential benefit. People that saw the world that way, they lived longer, they didn't get as sick, they didn't get as depressed, and they had lower levels of inflammation. So this was like cutting edge stuff at the time, and it dawned on me that, you know, for people to have that sort of orientation towards the world, it starts with a perspective, right? It starts with, if you behave a certain way, if you act like a jerk, it's really hard to get that sort of thing going in your life. And there's a lot of evidence that people that are forgiving and loving and kind, they get a lot of social support, of course, because they are endearing, right? And so it's easy for people to feel that way about them. So it dawned on me that if there was something we could do to change people's perception of their social surround, so that instead of seeing it as this competitive, threatening place, as we've evolved in many ways to see it, if we could help people see it as a potential place of collaboration and win-win scenarios, it would allow people not to feel so threatened. If they don't feel so threatened, they're not going to activate all this inflammation. If they don't activate all this inflammation, those nasty inflammatory molecules aren't going to feed back to the brain and make people feel anxious and stressed out. And people are going to be more able to access the benefits of civilization, right? Because, the saber-toothed tiger is not going to chase you tonight. God willing, God forbid, nobody's going to kill you. You're not going to get, most of the time, what's going to really get you upset is being slighted, ignored, all this stuff that I'm fighting with people at work, all this stuff, it's killing us, right? But if you don't feel that way, if you can find ways to collaborate with people, to build these coalitions, if you just don't have as much of that nasty, I gotta kill you kind of stress reactivity, all of a sudden civilization becomes like this wonderful playground, right? So it was really from that perspective that I realized, because I knew enough about Tibetan Buddhism, of which I'm a massive admirer, as you guys know, that the ultimate, the uber methodology that I knew about in the world for doing that was this Lojong tradition of this rigorous retraining, so that you paradoxically, eventually, in the high levels, see even your enemies as tremendous sources of benefit. It's the ultimate paradoxical reframing of the typical mammalian human stress response, right? So that is, from my perspective, the idea was that if we could train people in a meditation that was based on this Lojong compassion training, if it was successful, it would change perceptions of threat. That would then make people not respond to a stressor with this necessary inflammatory activation. So that was the first thing we tested. That's what we tested in college kids, where we trained them in CBCT and then put them in our nasty little laboratory stress test, and showed that the more they practiced, the less of this activation, this vigilant stress immune activation they got, that it really did what we thought it would do, right? And so that was why we started. Now, in the years subsequently, we now know that things are much more complicated, more interesting, and that the immune system is not just sort of the exhaust out the back of the brain's pipe. It's not just a bad thing the brain does. The immune system is really a second brain. That this idea that the immune system is one thing and the brain is another is wrong. It is a really integrated system, and we could talk all night about how that is, but suffice it to say, so that this idea of impacting the immune system is not just relevant to health anymore. It's actually almost certainly relevant to the behavioral and emotional effects of something like CBCT.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's hard to stress how important and cutting edge this work is that you're doing, and continues to be. I had a conversation with Omar Kuchuk, who I think you've also spoken to here at Emory Winship Cancer Institute, who studies how the process of methylation changes the expression and inhibition of genes to promote or protect against cancer.
Right.
And was so excited about your work because he sees the connection, because inflammation is correlated with methylation.
Oh, big time, yeah.
So what it seems to be, the picture that seems to be emerging is one where we can connect all these dots. And that's a question I'd like to ask you. Is it premature to say that your research is showing the power of being able to change our perspectives through techniques, Lojong-based techniques like CBCT, how that changes physiological processes like inflammation.
Yes.
That's changing gene expression.
Yes.
Which is putting us at risk or protecting us against cancer. This seems like a story that 10, 15 years ago would have sounded completely...
Like space age nuttiness,
exactly.
Like we smoked too much dope or something,
exactly.
right? Yeah, yeah. No, the evidence for this, the interesting thing about studying humans is that it's always messy, right? So you never get a one-to-one correspondence, but what's been very clear over the last 20 years is that the massive data support this idea, in fact, that they're not obviously the same thing, but that when we think about, what if you don't die young from infection, what you're going to die of is overactivity of these systems that evolved to protect you from, being eaten by a tiger or killed by a bug, right?
Mm-hmm.
These systems are they're reasonably good at those sort of things, but at this terrible price that they produce these hot, angry chemicals that over time do a bunch of stuff that burn you up, eat you alive. They shrink your brain, they shrink your telomeres, they damage your blood vessels. And so there really is one disease of modernity. And that disease has to do with a tendency for a sort of dysregulated hyperactivity of the brain and the immune system and the pathways by which they speak. And when these pathways are hyperactive in certain very predictable ways, you greatly increase the risk of getting one of a number of conditions that are all very comorbid with each other. And late in life, those things are cancer, stroke, dementia. In the middle years, they're diabetes, obesity, and depression. And in the younger years, sadly anymore, there are a lot of diabetes and obesity, but you see a lot of depression, anxiety, misery, those sorts of things. They're all driven by remarkably similar patterns of activity in the immune system and then back and forth with the brain. So when you look at conditions like schizophrenia, for instance, psychosis, just insane, you'd say, well, how bizarre, it's got to be a brain disorder. But yet when you look at the genes that set up the risk for it, many of the best ones are actually immune system genes, right? Mm-hmm. Many things we think of as being immune chemicals are actually involved in the functioning of the brain. Without them, the brain can't think or feel. And many chemicals that we think of as brain chemicals turn out to have these very powerful immune effects, right? So remember, you discover a chemical in the context of you're an immunologist and you're looking at a sickness, and so you say, oh, this is the immune system, and then because we name it the immune system, we think, well, God created the immune system, there it is, But no, that's not true. We just discovered it there. Right. It really turns out that nature is so much more complex. All these things are part of a much larger whole. And so, yes, it's absolutely true that something like CBCT, that when there's a heartfelt transformation and spontaneous perception and emotionality changes, it's very clear that it changes pathways that must be, to some degree, impacting how genes are expressed. And we now know from the work of guys like Kerry Ressler here at Emory in Atlanta that those changes can be passed on to the next generation, at least in animals, right? So the really striking thing is that in animals, behaviors can be encoded in one generation, and you can see them in the grandchildren that never had these experiences. And there's increasing evidence from things like Holocaust survivor studies that something similar may happen with people. So if you really wanted to be optimistic, or maybe pessimistic, because it explains maybe a lot about the world, but if you can change early in life gene expression patterns, and those changes promote caring, pro-social behavior, there's increasing reasons to think, and this really sounds like science fiction, that some of those changes can actually make their way into the germline cells, and you might actually change the behavior and the emotionality of your children. At least in animals, the data would suggest that that's possible. So this could really have huge ramifications and implications far beyond what we tend to think of, currently even.
That's fascinating, amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. It is.
One of the things that occurs to me is, we're having this conversation under the rubric of compassion meditation. And so one way of looking at this is that if we meditate and cultivate compassion, we gain these benefits. Our children and offspring might even gain benefits through our practice, which is incredible. And then there's another side to it, which is that this is happening in other people too. If we treat other people with compassion, as opposed to stressing them out, now we know that, that stressing somebody out as opposed to treating them with compassion is actually changing their body in a very fundamental way.
Here's the classic study. It's not a meditation study, but take two people, right? Or take two groups of people. One group, and you have them wear a sweatshirt, shirt, right? One group of people, how does it work? One group of people jump out of an airplane for the first time in their lives, right? They're sweating like pigs because they're just, they may be excited, but they're terrified, right? You take the shirt off, you stick it away because you're going to harvest that sweat, okay? You take another group of people and you have them run on a treadmill, okay? And you collect their sweat. So now you have stress sweat and exercise sweat, okay? Then you take totally different people that don't know anything about any of this, and you stick them in a brain scanner, and you wave that sweat in front of their nose. And what they found is that the exercise sweat and the stress sweat totally activate the brains of those people differently. They can't tell. You say, can you tell any difference in this sweat? They go, no, there's sweat. But without knowing it, when you smell the sweat of somebody that's been stressed out, all the stress centers in your brain activate, and your cortisol goes up, and you become more vigilant. You're more, you're better at tasks of vigilance. You have no idea why. You have no idea that this has happened to you, but your brain knows, right? So we catch each other's joy, misery, amazingly, right? So there's all this data in the last 10 years showing that depression clusters together, that if you become depressed, the effect goes out to about 3 or 4 people. So these are not even people you know, right? So you get depressed, huge increased risk that your buddy here is going to get depressed. But there's now, even Chicago, pretty good risk she's going to get depressed. You don't even know Chicago in this scenario.
I thought I did.
That's not true. And it goes all the way out to the lady with the headset. So it's a sort of 6 degrees of separation thing. So yes, and one of the things that's at the forefront, and that we hope to study actually in Arizona, if we do this foster care study, is this idea that it's an old Buddhist idea, right? You sort of dedicate your merit to the world, that it may be that people that don't do compassion meditation will actually get many of the biologic benefits if they're in an environment where other people that are giving them grief change their behavior. That's one of the great predictions of the practice that none of us have managed to study yet. But you're exactly right.
Fascinating, fascinating. So the aura that we experience around spiritual teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama is actually his sweat.
Could be his sweat. Could be his sweat. Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I want to open it up to questions, but I want to. So I hope you all have some questions after these fascinating talks, because we only have an hour. But I want to raise the first question while you all are thinking, because there's one topic that has been appearing a lot recently in the last couple months about meditation, and usually most of the articles that have come out of the last 10 years of meditation have been just all the amazing, wonderful effects of meditation. Now we've seen a spate of articles talking about the dangerous side effects of meditation, and sparked by some of the work of Willoughby Britton and her project, which originally was called the Dark Night Project, looking at how people would go off and to do meditation retreats, and it would actually trigger psychotic events and all sorts of mental problems. And there's a lot of attention now being paid to this, and a lot that's out there in the media. So I'd like to pose this question to both of you. Maybe let's start with you, Geshe-la. What you think about that, and I remember when we were at the conference with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Mind and Life Conference in 2005 in Washington, D.C., where he made a comment, actually, that people should study analytical meditation. There was also a lot of talk about, how wonderful mindfulness is and how we shouldn't, maybe see it as a panacea, but maybe we want to see it as a panacea because it's so great, everybody should be doing this. And His Holiness kind of, obviously is a bit more cautious about that. What would your perspective be on the possible dangers of meditation, or the idea that meditation or certain meditation practices really shouldn't be practiced by just anyone?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I wouldn't say the danger of meditation, the negative effects of trying to do meditation have been documented, for centuries. I think that it's like that. It's the consequence, I think, of not doing the right way, meditation. So you would not say that meditation is eliciting these dangers, but rather, trying to do meditation in ways that's not appropriate, that's not, conducive. So we can say something, I mean, that you know, working out, exercising is great, right? You know, like, but we can, if we overdo, you know, that certain postures or the certain activities, or do it, you know, like the weightlifting, you know, that if we lift not proper way without building the certain kind of muscles and so forth, you know, you can end up hurting yourself. It wouldn't be because it's a kind of the consequence of exercise, but I would say that it's a consequence of not exercising properly. And I think that the meditation is the same thing. If you do the meditation properly, you know, properly meaning that knowing that how much, you know, what when you are beginning, how to start under, you know, proper guidance of those who are experienced, who can help. The meditation can be great help. But on the other hand, if one engages in meditation, you know, in ways that are not appropriate, you know, not proper, then you can end up, you know, getting all kinds of the problems. I mean, that like one of the things in the Buddhist tradition we know is that you know, the mind and something called lung, or
lung disorders,
you know, energy. These two go together, and obviously wherever you have mental activity, mental focus, or the mental engagement, you know, it involves this certain kind of mental, there's a certain kind of that energy, the lung. So if I were to go and, you know, before I'm, you know, ready, or the kind of build up certain strength, inner mental strength, and perspectives and so forth, and then if I'm going to go like the 10 hours, 20, you know, per day for 3-4 days, I probably will end up, you know, disturbing the very lung, and that will disturb my mental state, because those two are connected. You know, so that's what I think that this we need to have, you know, more understanding, better understanding about what these meditations are, how they are done. You know, that you know, some of the I think that this is where, as we were discussing the other day, you know, there's generally, I mean, now that, you know, it's doing meditation is like sexy, right? You know, like it's good for you and like that, and then but without really doing it properly, you can end up hurting, and that's why you know, we need more of these contemplative scholars to really to articulate it, have the kind of the sophisticated understanding of what is mindfulness, how it is done, what is the mechanism in doing that. You know, there are not many, but there are some scholars doing that. You know, our colleague John Dunn here, I mean, that it's one of the leading scholars in this field, making contributions certainly, and that there are others emerging, you know, like that. But I think that it's a field that where the scientists are doing research on meditation of this and that. We need to also simultaneously have more sophisticated, better understanding about what those practices are, you know, how they are done traditionally, you know, what their roots are and the mechanism. I think that's really important, because otherwise, you know, we can also see a lot of people kind of getting that dark night experience also.
Right.
I couldn't agree more. Imagine doing antidepressant studies, and you're like, I want to study an antidepressant, so I get my whole beautiful thing set up. But for the antidepressant, I just wander up and down, you know, different little, you know, stores in the street and just buy whatever, you know, it says antidepressant, that should be all right, you know. Our lack of an understanding of the mechanisms internal to meditation in the West as scientists is pretty impressive, you know. And I'm kind of a black sheep in the meditation research world, because I'm not, as everybody knows, I'm not a hardcore meditator. I'm kind of a failed meditator. There's a lot of, so part of the challenge, a lot of people, got a lot of true believers. And that's great in a way, because people are passionate about it. but they also then push agendas that's not quite the question you asked. The question you asked, though, I will tell you that that's it. I can't say anything more. That's exactly right, in my opinion. The other thing is that as a psychiatrist, I've noticed over the years that sometimes people that are mentally unstable or they're heading into mental instability, like a moth to the flame, are drawn to spiritual practices, right? So the classic example, somebody with, like, say, bad manic depression, bipolar disorder, where one of the classic symptoms of mania is hyper-religiosity, right? And over the years, I'd had patients where the deal was they would have to trust me. There'd be a certain point where I'd mandate they put the Bible away, or that's it, no more meditating, because it's a symptom that they're about to start believing that Jesus is telling them they can float in the air, so they should walk off the bridge. You know, I mean, so that's another element of it, is that there's a little bit of a selection bias. But I'll tell you finally, the other comment is that when back in the beginning of the Tummo business, I knew nothing, and I went to this Tibetan medicine conference. But because I'd yapped off in the conference, people thought I had some association with it. I had 3 or 4 people, all Westerners, come and tell me about their long-term, years of retreat and doing things like Tummo, and they went psychotic, you know. And I could tell by looking at these people as a psychiatrist, they still weren't really together so well, right? Very spiritual, but pretty darn crazy, you know. And it made a very big impression on me, because I decided I wasn't going to study Tummo in Western populations. That this is how I ended up being told I was a goat. I would only do it with the folks that, you know, from the tradition itself, because I'd been around too much nuttiness as a result of my job, that I really, so, oh my God, this is crazy land, you know. So that's another element of it, that yeah, anything that's powerful, you know, it can be misused, and anything that's hugely helpful can be damaging. And that's been my experience of all potential beneficial modalities, that they're not just panaceas in that way. They require, you need a doctor. You need somebody, this is the power of the guide or the teacher, to make sure that, you know, hey, you know, back off a little bit, you're starting to, you know, your loom's starting to go that way, right, you know. That's something that we don't have in the West to some degree, and it's the downside of the rapid expansion of it everywhere, right? There's a lot of good in that, but there's definitely going to be some casualties because it's not supervised, I think.
Great. And there's a line from the Lojong tradition: "Don't turn gods into demons." Questions? Yes, you all the way in the back.
Right. Yes.
Bring the microphone around.
So I did some of the work with Kerry on the paper with the mice inheriting sensitivities across generations. And since you brought it up, I just wanted to make a comment, and then that'll lead to a question. When we put out the paper, we got a lot of press, and what we were trying to say also is that not only are you predisposed with, you know, whatever your ancestors have gone through, there's a built-in plasticity in the system, which will allow you to recalibrate. If you engage in certain practices with mice, it'll be extinction training, etc. And that was really lost in the buzz that followed.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious whether you face resistance to the plasticity hypothesis, or if you haven't, what studies might be out there to suggest that there is, or longitudinal studies to suggest that there's a plasticity and the system equilibrates, or homeostasis sets in, or allostasis sets in over time with some of these practices.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, right, so everybody understands that basically, you know, it's a little bit like karma, right? There's a sense that you've got your karma, which is, you know, in this case, you may enter the world with an epigenetic programming profile to some degree driven by, interestingly, the experiences of your forebears. But it's not, it's a proclivity, it's not a death sentence, it's not a mandate, right? It's a tendency, and that the tendency can be overcome by, in this case, you know, with the rodents, you can do extinction things. There is some pretty interesting evidence that meditative practices can change factors that are linked, we think, to, say, neuroplasticity, right? So, you know, there's a couple of studies now suggesting that if you measure just a gross measure, say brain volume, especially of certain key areas like hippocampus, parts of the prefrontal cortex, that relatively short periods of meditation seem to be associated with increased size in these areas. Sarah Lazar has shown that, and somebody else whose name I can't remember showed it, and it hasn't been published yet. But one of the interesting things that we've done in this large study that's just finished of adults, we looked at mindfulness training that did not have an explicit compassion component, versus CBCT, the cognitively based compassion training, versus a health discussion group. We flew about 50 people to Boston for brain imaging before they got the interventions and after. And our collaborator, Gail Disboards, using very, very kind of novel methodology that they've got up there for measuring brain volume, has found that the compassion training actually increased, the mindfulness didn't do this. It did something down in the hippocampus, but that the compassion training actually grew the size of an area called dorsal-medial prefrontal cortex, which is a key area for empathy, but it also has a lot to do with regulating autonomic responses relevant to things like inflammation. So it hadn't come out yet, but there is a little bit of evidence, again, not large numbers, but suggesting that if you spend 8 weeks doing this, whether it's the practice of it, because there wasn't a practice, this did not have a practice time effect. In this population, it might have just been knocking your head around some of these ideas that are very novel, that you could benefit from your enemies, for instance. What a crazy idea, right? But anyway, there is some suggestion that that these practices may invoke neuroplasticity. We don't do brain biopsies, so we don't know, and we didn't get BDNF in these guys peripherally. Some of the things that kind of go along with plasticity. But the answer is yes. And I think even from my kind of poor Buddhist understanding, one might think about this as practices that can begin to then remold one's karma, right? Again, destiny is flexible, and the biology would suggest the same thing. You work with Kerry? Is that the study?
Yes, that was our paper.
Okay. Yeah, it's a major. These guys, it's a really impactful thing that y'all have done.
Another question? Raise your hand. Yes, right here.
Yes, is this on?
Yeah.
Interested in your sweat study. We're talking about, you can think of that as frequencies in some respect, but comes to mind food can affect this too, as well as, I could be funny, say passion fruit might affect compassion, but food and the effect, eating the right foods, stressors in the immune system, all that as well, can sort of be a meditation. I don't know how else to say it, but...
Oh yeah, it's a huge, huge effect. So we're gearing up, the next study we're going to do is actually a fasting study. It's really interesting. It turns out, we've been talking about this. Much of my life is spent sort of trying to repurpose ancient practices that have been discovered repeatedly by different cultures that sort of promote healing or sort of elevate the mind and the spirit, right? So it turns out, we also like to study hyperthermia. I got my little list of things that have been discovered at least 10 times, around the world that, people aren't stupid, If you're doing it again and again and again, it's like the Lojong. People aren't hanging on to it because it doesn't work, right? It's doing something. So yeah, absolutely, it's true. And one of the interesting things, I'm thinking of Shantideva, right? There's a whole part of the Guide to the Bodhisattva way of life talking about the best circumstances for doing meditation. There's all this physical stuff, right? And so I think these things, I have a deep interest in how we might be able to harness and tweak these physiologic pathways that talk to the brain and make the brain feel certain ways. I think that's one of the great, I'm a little bit of a minority here, but I think that's one of the great potential ways we might enhance psychiatric treatment. But clearly, it resonates that these things are not, they're not opposed to each other. They actually are synergistic with each other. So if you make a list of everything in the modern world that promotes depression, that list is exactly the same as everything that promotes heart disease. And it's all about inflammation. Every single one of those things. Sleep loss, bad diet, processed foods, not exercising, being obese, not sleeping. All these things are pro-inflammatory. And the big one, one of the big ones, is this stress, this sense that the world is a dangerous place full of other humans with big old antlers, right? And so the fact that all these things feed into these common pathways, I think, is one of the beautiful synergizing sort of, there's a consilience here that's very, very deep. And it really suggests that things like CBCT fall into that. So this is why I wanted to do compassion training all those years ago, was because the content of the training was exactly the content you'd want if you wanted to reduce that contribution to this sort of inflammatory overdrive that we're beleaguered with in the modern world.
I've got a question coming in from Spain, from our friends at
Spain.
the
Okay,
University of
hold on.
Valencia.
Yeah.
And they want to know about the current research studies and what is actually going on right now.
We're in a smidge of a lull right now, but it's only temporary, I assure you.
Well, actually, Brandon, you can also mention one of the studies. Actually, we will be launching. In fact, next week, starting next week, the first class, September 10th, is at the Emory Medical School with the second-year medical school students, and this would be there are a number of measures that we will do. Jenny Mascaro actually is the scientific PI on that, and it is known that in medical school by the third year, that so many of the students end up with depressed, right? And there are all kinds of other problems.
About 35%, 40%. It's
a
big
huge,
problem.
yeah. So at the medical school at Emory, they want to introduce CBCT and then see if that makes any difference. So it will be offered to half of the second year class students will be offered CBCT, and then half will not be offered. So that in that way we will see how it differs. There are other studies that are coming soon. Jordan actually, and again Johnny Mascaro with the veterans will be doing a study, and it will be launched in January. Next January, it was supposed to be launched this fall, but for some reasons that it had to be postponed. And then there are others, like
Erin Robbins, who's in the back there, and I are just starting a study at the International Community School, and it's a CBCT training for school teachers, elementary school teachers, who will then who will go through a CBCT class over 10 weeks, but then we'll also be introducing it into their classrooms, and we're studying the effects both on the teachers and in the classrooms. And so that's a follow-up study to a study that we did at the Paideia School a couple of years ago, with the help of Geshe Lobsang and Chuck also. So we're very excited to see the effects of that.
And
what about that with the nurses?
We also have a study that should be starting in hopefully in a couple months with nurses in the neonatal care unit at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, looking at how it changes the workplace environment among the nurses.
Yeah, that's really
And I know that Tim is here somewhere, but also there is another study about that. What is that? The itching that.
Yes.
the dermatology.
The pruritus
Yes.
study with
Yeah.
the Department of Dermatology.
Yes.
And we just did we in the editorial sense, it was really my colleagues, did a study of CBCT in female breast cancer survivors. It was 30 people, so a small study, but half of them got a wait list and half of them got 8 weeks of CBCT. And there was a big impact on less depression, less stress, more hopefulness, and there was some problem with the blood. Somebody let a refrigerator rot, which is shocking. But there was, even with that horrible screw up, there was a signal that it may have lowered some of these inflammatory mediators. And then we've been, I've sort of stepped out of the study world, but I've been working, we're working on 2 projects that we think will eventually become studies. We just finished an 8-week course of CBCT for 4th and 5th grade Pascua Yaqui, Native American kids that were having truancy problems on the reservation. And it was uptaken really powerfully. I mean, it was really, now the adults want it. So we're sort of exploring whether or not we can, there's a lot of synergy between Native American ideas and some Tibetan Buddhist ideas. And so that was really, we've sort of invested. You can't just go in and do a study right away. You look like kind of an imperialistic pig. We're really interested in not doing that, but really trying to work collaboratively. And then in January, we're going to do our first CBCT intervention in a foster care adolescent group home in Atlanta. We did it in Atlanta before, but in Tucson. This is with Tad Pace, who's now out there, with the idea eventually of looking to see, when we talked about could training in CBCT change the biology of other people? Something like a group home where these people are in a very usually stressful environment, they're all together, allows us to actually do some very novel ways of looking at, if I change you, how can I measure how it changes me? And so we've got a couple of projects that we think within a year or two, will sort of lead to some novel studies. But the breast cancer thing is actually, that'll be published, and so that's another nifty. And then there's some work, people are interested with PTSD. We talked about that today out in San Diego.
In San Diego, yes.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There are a lot of kind of feasibility studies and pilot projects.
And
that
we're
are out there.
analyzing data. We spent 5 years doing this massive thing that many people in this room had a piece of in various ways called the CALM study, where we randomized healthy adults to either CBCT, mindfulness, or the health discussion group. And we ended up with about 200 people. So it's a pretty large study between, about 80 in each condition. And we're just now kind of finishing running all the biological data and all this stuff. So in the next year, we're going to know a lot more about some of the biological effects and whether compassion training is different, where is it the same, where is it different. So there's going to be a lot of information coming out. It's not a new study, but there'll be a lot of information in the next year, I think.
Great. Well, we're out of time. I just want to mention before we close, I thought Chuck was going to give a talk tonight, and they wanted to have more of a discussion, so you all missed out. I guess he's a fantastic presenter and speaker also. But there is a link to a video of him giving a TED Talk on CBCT on the Emory Tibet website. So if you haven't seen that, I would suggest go checking it out.
Yeah. And there's an hour-long version now that's even better, but it's not on your website. I need to send it to you. Yeah.
Okay.
We did a big talk that was really, kind of the magnum opus on sort of the research and thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay, great. Well, we'll get a link to that and put that on the CBCT website. Please join me in thanking our speakers, and thank you for coming.